Attention all parents seeking to break the chains of conformity in education. Welcome to Paradox, where your child's mind is liberated, nurtured, and empowered to thrive in today's complex world. I'm Will Roosh, an educator with nearly 20 years of experience, fiercely compassionate about fostering viewpoint diversity and critical thinking. If you're tired of the cookie-cutter approach to education and yearn for a platform that embraces individuality, you're in the right place. Picture this, your child no longer confined to the limitations of traditional education, but instead flourishing in an environment that encourages curiosity, questions the status quo, and celebrates diverse perspectives. With Paradox, your child will embark on a transformative journey guided by live teaching, Zoom workshops, personalized support, and a curriculum designed to challenge, inspire, and ignite their intellectual curiosity. Say goodbye to the one-size-fits-all approach and hello to the world of limitless possibilities. Join me at Paradox and let's empower your child to think critically, embrace diversity, and become the architects of their own future. Go to paradox.com to learn more.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher in Los Angeles. And my podcast is about critical thinking and viewpoint diversity. And as I leave the classroom, which is terrifying, to go build Paradox, my online educational platform for supplemental critical thinking education, I got the GOAT. I got the person who's been doing it and doing it really, really well for a long time. I'm thrilled to have her, Julie Bogart. She's the creator and owner of Brave Writer, which is an online writing and language arts program. Tons of activities for homeschooling, supporting homeschooling parents and stuff like that. And Jordan Peterson, who I talk about a lot, I love Jordan Peterson. He said, to be a good critical thinker, you have to be a great writer. Focus on being a writer. And that is your world. Julie, thank you so much for taking time here to talk to me about this. I'm thrilled to jump into all things homeschool education, but also critical thinking with you. Thank you so much.
Gosh, what an honor. I'm from Los Angeles too. I just had to throw that in there.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that you're in LA. That's great.
Are you in LA now?
I'm not. I live in
Okay.
Cincinnati. I've been here for 25 years, but I grew up in Los Angeles, went to UCLA. So it's still my heart home. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So tell me and my audience a little bit about how you got started in this world. Like, how did you get started into this world of supporting homeschool families and stuff like that? Because you've been doing it for a little bit. I saw like Washington Post and others show that homeschooling is just, it's like a hockey stick. It's growing really, really big right now. But you got into it kind of before that trend. So how did that all happen for you?
Yeah. So back in my young adulthood, I was active in my church community. I was a missionary. And I actually met other people who were working abroad and they were homeschooling their kids. We lived in Morocco, which is in North Africa. This was the mid 1980s. And actually, the first time someone asked me about homeschooling, I was like, home what? I had never even heard that word pair. That would not be true today. Yeah. But I was sold immediately. I think the thing that really drew me was the idea of customized learning, tailor-made to the individual student. I had actually quite a good public education. I was raised in the Las Virgenes school district with a lot of ex-hippies as teachers who had lived on other countries in the Peace Corps and came with a lot of wonderful intentions and innovative educational ideas. And as I got older, I had the opportunity to TA in a school in Brentwood when I was at UCLA. And all of that liveliness of education was gone. It was all test-based. It was all there was no Common Core yet, but there were like criteria. And it had just lost kind of that sense of adventure that education had felt to me as a child. So when I heard about homeschooling, I'm like, this is the way I can preserve that feeling for my children, is if I take that job for myself. So that's really how I heard about it. I started homeschooling in 1990. I have 5 kids and they're all grown now. But yeah, I was definitely there at the beginning. I mean, homeschooling really started in the 70s, but anybody who homeschooled in the 80s and 90s is still kind of at the front end of the whole movement.
Yeah. And something that I saw you've mentioned before is part of what your program does is empower parents to be writing coaches. So it's not just like you're their instructor, it's to help the parents to be the instructor.
100%. In fact, what happened with me is I was a freelance writer, ghostwriter, magazine editor in the 90s while I was raising my kids. And one of my good friends came to me one day and she said, Julie, my kids hate writing. And every writing program we use, they hate. I don't understand how to teach it. Could you help me? And I said, well, get me the program, because I wasn't using a program. I was just teaching because I understood writing. So she brought me the program. We opened it up. There was a sample paragraph, and then it was a descriptive paragraph with a criteria that the student should copy for their own paragraph. And I turned to her and I said, so did you read the sample? She said, yeah. I said, did you like it? She said, what do you mean? I said, when you read it, did you say to yourself, gosh, I wish there were a second paragraph? She's like, I can't even remember what it said. And I just closed the book. And the question I asked her was, why would you teach your kids to write using a model so tedious and uninteresting that you don't even remember it? Schools treat writing like it is learning how to do laundry. There's a recipe, there's a system, and you follow it, and you have to put words in the right order, in the right places. Teachers hold in their imaginations something that researchers Knobloch and Brannon call the ideal text. And students are being trained to guess what that text is, imagining the way the teacher thinks, and then using the words they think the teacher will approve. And then they put it in this like mechanized paragraph or essay or short story. And they never actually get in touch with what the power of writing is, which is getting in touch with your own voice, your ideas, your perceptions, your perspective, and communicating those in a way that sounds like you. And so schools have created this generations now of adults who feel terrified of writing, who have actual writing trauma.
Yeah.
I feel like a therapist half the time with adults. They come to me and tell me their horrific stories of how they were taught writing. And yet we would never treat people that way if we were teaching them to speak. We're encouraging, we don't judge them, we accept their mistakes as evidence that they're getting there, completely different way of approaching language.
Yeah, something I tell students all the time is they're like, oh, I have this essay to write. I was like, wait, if you're bored writing it, imagine us, reading and grading, 3 classes of 30 of them. I was like, if you got to have fun, you got to be into what you're writing, because it's going to come across on the other side for the receiver.
Okay, literally, you just recreated one of my best known quotes, which is, if you were bored writing it, I'll be bored reading it. I say that all the time. I can't even believe you said that, because it's such a popular thing for me to say. The other thing is that if we are training kids in the typical school model, what we're saying is there's an authority that has the body of information that is the acceptable, approvable body. And we're asking kids to jettison all the factors that shape the way they perceive the world. So we're asking them to set aside their culture, their religious training, their background, their economics, their personal experiences, their relationships. And we're asking them to adopt sort of a universal, only it's never universal, it's particular to the school or the teacher or the region, but this like universal truth. And what ends up happening is we sacrifice innovation, creativity, the thoughts that might be considered outside the boundaries, but that actually need to be incorporated if we're going to ever solve our problems. That's the piece about writing and thinking that I think gets missed. We're so busy trying to train people to get A's, we've forgotten to include the thinker that inhabits the body.
Yeah, and that's something that I've just seen in education over and over and over again, which is, again, why I want to go more broad, is because they are so failure averse. They're so scared of failure, and they don't understand. They're not like little kids. Like, I have a 2-year-old, and like he falls down all the time. He just gets right back up, like that whole cliche thing. We know that if you're playing basketball, you're going to miss a lot of shots to get good. Kobe Bryant has missed more shots than anyone else in NBA history, but that's not what he's remembered for. Shooters got to shoot. You're going to have to fail.
Totally.
And yet kids somehow only apply that in certain areas. And I guarantee, they don't apply that to their writing, because they're so scared of getting a lower mark. Especially, I've taught at like more like prestigious private schools too, and public schools. I've kind of taught all around. And at the prestigious private schools, they're so scared about their transcript, so they can't get anything wrong. And that's going to limit them so much in reaching their potential, just like anything else.
Part of the problem is that when you are applying a standard, it's much easier to grade mechanics than it is the sort of subtlety of thought that is a person's writing voice. But the problem with the mechanics is All you prove when you correct someone else's mechanics is that you know how it should be written. The person who made the mistake already doesn't know. So what you do is you're literally shaming them for not being fluent yet in the thing that you're holding them accountable to. You can't hold someone accountable to a skill they don't have. And so this obsession that the academic institutions have with accuracy over power in writing is absurd.
Yeah.
My writing hero, Dr. Peter Elbow from the 1990s, popularized the whole concept of free writing and this idea that you give full attention to your ideas and thoughts and you ignore and don't worry about spelling, punctuation, and grammar. That's the birthplace of writing. So the way that I teach families who are new to this way of thinking is like this. If you've got children, let's say you have resistant 13-year-olds, or you have a child who's not reading yet, or you have a child who's a little intimidated by writing, here's the way you can begin. Let's say you're in the kitchen, you're making dinner. In runs your little child, Seth. He was out in the backyard. The dog was chasing a squirrel. He comes in, he starts saying, Mom, I got to tell you, Rocky was chasing this squirrel. When you hear this eruption of fluent speech, I want you to stop whatever you're doing, grab the back of a supermarket receipt, an envelope, whatever, and start writing their words down as they're saying them. So you don't ask them to tell you a story. You wait till the story is in full bloom and you start jotting it down. Here's what most kids do when they see you writing down their words spontaneously. They're like, hey, Mom, what are you doing? What's happening? Here's what you say back. You say, I'm sorry, this is so good. I've got to write it down because I don't want to forget it. That's the script. So you jot it all down. This will work great with your little kids because you got some little guys over there. Later that day at dinner with the family gathered, you pull out this piece of writing and you say to the family, hey, Seth was telling me about how Rocky chased a squirrel and it was so good. I didn't want to forget it. So I wrote it down. I just want to read it to you guys right now. You read those words aloud, that child will, for the first time, make the connection that they're an author. Because the moment your words are transcribed, it doesn't matter who does the transcribing. Once they are preserved in writing and read back to an interested audience, they're an author. And this is usually the first time a child realizes that what lives inside is what goes on the paper, not what is in the imagination of the teacher, but what's actually in them. I usually recommend after the dinner, take that little story, throw it in the library basket, and when you read picture books, return to it regularly. Oh, let's read Seth's story again. You will be shocked. At a certain point, they kind of start telling you to write their thoughts down because they suddenly see, oh, I want to preserve what I'm thinking about so that it can be read again.
Oh, I love that. You have to encourage them to just let their thoughts go, and so that they can analyze their thoughts and everything, and not just be the police to give all those kinds of parameters and stuff. I've heard things about when people say their kids don't like reading. It's like, have them read what they love until they love to read.
Yes,
You know?
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, Charlotte Mason, one of my favorite educators, she's from Britain, late 19th century, early 20th century educator. She says children are born persons. Children are born persons. They're not adults in training.
Yeah.
They're not misbehaving adults. They're literally persons. And if we think about the annual school photograph that we take, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, that's what writing is. Writing will look like a kindergartner if the kindergartner is allowed to write like a kindergartner. But what we typically do is we're like, we need this second grader to sound like they're in sixth grade because eventually they'll be in ninth grade and then eventually in college. And so we just keep moving the essay format down to like third grade now, which is absurd. Their brains aren't even ready for essay writing in third grade. It would be like taking those school photos and photoshopping them into an adult picture because we want them to get there. There's no reason to do that. We want this accurate record of who they are at each stage of development. And writing will remind you of who they are better than any photograph you take. I save everything. I have all my kids writing. I go back, I cry, I reread it, I laugh. It's such a gift.
I love that. I'm gonna start applying that with my boys. You wrote a book, Raising Critical Thinkers.
I did.
So critical thinking is that's my bag. That's my whole thing. That's what Cylinder Radio is. How would you define critical thinking for my audience? Because there's different ways you can kind of like define that. We kind of all know what it is, I guess, but to put it in into just like a concise kind of
Yes.
um staple.
Well,
Yeah.
may I start with what it's not?
Yes, please.
Because so many people think critical thinking is being able to critique the other guy's view. I have been on so many podcasts and radio shows of all political and religious persuasions. And here's something I've noticed. Most of us feel about critical thinking the way we feel about driving. We think we're good at it and everybody else is terrible.
Right.
And the reason for that is when you're behind the steering wheel of your own thinking, you can understand the logic journey you took to get to the conclusion that you've drawn. And you're not able to perceive or understand what the other outlying ideas are that would prevent somebody else. Because once you've drawn your conclusion, it all stacks up and aligns for you. Critical thinking, then, in my view, is the self-awareness to recognize that journey, to recognize the biases, the instincts, the experiences, and the beliefs that inform and shape your point of view. So that when you're in dialogue with someone else, you're able to appreciate that they're going through that exact same thing. Usually, when we get in these arguments with people online, particularly, we're so busy spouting facts because we've been trained by education to believe if I say a fact and attach an authority to it, everyone will fall into line, which isn't what happens because we all have a different source of authority. But we've been trained to believe that, right? In school, there is a multiple choice test. There's a correct answer key. And no matter how much you justify your answer, there's only considered one right answer and the teacher knows what it is. That's our worldview when we come into Facebook. We're like, well, I know the answer. Why aren't you falling into line?
Yeah.
Critical thinking is the capacity to start asking those questions. Well, why does that person literally see it so different than me? What bits of information do they have that I don't have? What experiences do they have that are different than mine? What community influences their beliefs? We discovered when I was doing the research that loyalty to your community is a greater factor in what you believe and think than any amount of logic, reason, facts, data, experience, because we do not want to lose our people. So we will bend ourselves even around pieces of our own data that we consider not super reliable. We will find a way to rely on it if it means we get to keep our people.
Yeah, John Haidt, who's been a great influence on
Oh,
me.
yeah.
And he says, ideology and morality binds and blinds. So it binds us to our tribe, and then
Beautiful.
it blinds us to other perspectives. But the way that I approach critical thinking is through all the different things. It's the neuroscience, it's all the Socratic method stuff.
Yes.
I see my role as an educator definitely as the person asking the questions, not having the answers. That's all of what Paradox
Beautiful.
is about. It's just being the person to just ask the right questions to help the kids develop their own way of thinking and why they think what they think, which is exactly what you're saying. It's very, very aligned. But evolutionarily, you're better off for survival to stay in the tribe and be
That's
wrong
right.
than be correct and out on your own. So it's a survival mechanism of, even though this is wrong, if this doesn't get me ostracized from the group, I'm going to stick with what's wrong. And it's very hard to go against that. It's very scary to go against your group. And it doesn't matter what that is. Yeah, it could be a political team. It could be any kind of ideological team. It could be your family, any of that. Like you're fighting biology when you do critically think. So it's understandable why it's so rare and why so few people do it.
I agree. I think there are factors that can make it safer. And I love that you talked about asking questions. One of the jokes in my business is that when I wrote Raising Critical Thinkers, the subtitle should have been 1,001 questions you could ask somebody, because every chapter is just loaded with these kinds of questions. But they're questions not so much about the items. They really are a self-awareness piece. When I first drafted the book, the working title was Self-Aware Thinking, because I felt like that's what's missing. Everybody is capable of noticing the flaws in someone else's argument, but can you actually recognize, for instance, this happens to me all the time, or it used to when I spent more time on Facebook. I'm scrolling along. Some woman I knew from high school, who I thought I understood, shares some article about a political position I don't hold, and I immediately feel smug. Oh, she's so dumb.
Yeah.
Why in the world does she think that? because my first reaction is protection of my own point of view. I'm looking for more community members. I'm not curious about how she formed that belief structure. So one of the things I'm trying to help students understand is their own tells. For me, smugness is a big one. Another one is being sweaty and actually having a fast heart rate. I remember when I was going through a period of reevaluating some very core beliefs that I had that differed from my husband's, I didn't feel free to talk about them with him. And one night I was in bed, he was dead asleep. I snuck down the stairs into this very room, and I came to look at a website that I knew I wasn't allowed to look at. And I could hardly type the words. I was shaking so badly and sweating so much because I was so afraid of being found out that I was curious about this belief structure that was not allowed in my world. And that's what I'm talking about, like starting to recognize those patterns. Even in the space of homeschooling, there are so many ideological wars. And I've lost business. I've been kicked out of conferences. I mean, literally just for being a curious person, for actually opening the door to beliefs that are not welcome. So critical thinking has a cost, and that cost is real. It can cost you your marriage. It can cost you your parents. It can cost you your church. It can cost you business. That said, I am so much happier as a human being. I feel like I've been returned to humanity, because when I meet someone now that I don't agree with, my knee jerk is to be curious, not to want to convert them. I'm like, oh, wow, they hold that view so strongly. It must be really meaningful. I've got to find out why.
Yeah, Julie, we are very similar in that way. Very
Good.
similar. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I've had broken relationships. My Instagram, which is where I left the classroom. I mean, I was in the classroom up until, like 2 weeks ago. But
Okay.
but I went onto Instagram to just test, like, can I do what I do in the classroom with like across the screen? Because I was thinking of like bigger, like how do I expand my classroom? Because I was doing great things in my classroom. And I get called every name. People swear that I'm like a hardcore MAGA person. They swear that I'm like a woke teacher in Los Angeles. They label me all of these things that I am not. And it's just they really wrestle with like the fact that I'm none of those things. I am
Yes.
all over the place. I have all these different viewpoints. I have strong beliefs, but they're loosely held based on the information. And I want to get, my ego is not attached with having the right answers. It's attached with getting to the right answers. So if you prove me wrong, I embrace that because it means that I'm one step closer to being right. And it's shocking to me that like the way you and I are talking right now, I think a lot of people at home will be like, yeah, I'm like that too. Maybe, but I don't see a lot of it. Honestly, I don't. And I don't know what made you this way. Because I'm kind of naturally this way, but what did it for me, just real quickly, it's not about me.
Yeah.
But like, what did it for me was, just so you know, is I married into a very different culture. I'm like waspy Northeastern, like liberal Democrat type, college educated. Everyone in my family's college educated. Everyone in my family, my whole family tree is white, all that kind of stuff. And I married a Filipino immigrant who came to this country with nothing and, 10 people in a 1-bedroom apartment and all that kind of stuff, entrepreneurial and small business owners and stuff. And it was my favorite person on the planet, still is. And so all of these ideas that I was kind of thinking were like wrong or bad or whatever it is, I was like, well, wait a second, but the person I love most is not those things. And that started like this little pebble rolling down the hill. And then all of these other things, I'd say like in like around like 2015, 2016, 2017, around Trump and the culture wars and stuff started to happen. And I was like, how is the country divided 50-50 on this? There must be something legitimate to that crazy side or that crazy side. So it just all kind of happened for me all at once. And that's why I started this podcast, because I wanted to talk to people from different perspectives. This idea, cylinder radio is this concept that from one side, it's a circle. And then from one side, it's a rectangle. And if we talk to each other, then we understand that they're complex 3-dimensional shapes. But that's what it did for me. That was just like this moment. And it was very uncomfortable. It was like, oh my gosh, everything I thought was true is not true. Everything I thought was moral is maybe not moral. Everything's not so clear cut. What was it for you? Were you always like this? How did you get to this point?
I mean, I think I've always been interested in meaning, and I have been curious about other other ways of being. But really, you just nailed it. I have, in the middle of raising critical thinkers, I have 3 ways that we form our beliefs. And I think I'm going to go through them because your experience with your wife is the third one, and it's the most powerful. So the first way that we gather our beliefs and data is often through reading or education, reading in particular. Reading is meaningful for gathering a lot of information quickly, but it is completely under our own personal control. So I can choose what I read. I can choose what part of what I'm reading to skip. I can read with the text. I can read against the text. Like I might have read that article my friend posted, judging it the whole way, not open to whatever case it was making, right? So when we read, we gather a lot of data quickly, but we use it usually to support the views we already hold or to invalidate the views we don't hold. And Dr. Peter Elbow, who I mentioned earlier, he said it takes something like 6 or 8 readings before you even crack the door open to a view you don't hold. Like the first reading will never do it. So reading is very much under our control. It's valuable for education, but it isn't really good for critical thinking. The second level is called experience. And experience allows you to involve more of your body. So you've got the senses working for you. You've got activity working for you. To compare reading and experience, I'll give you this example. Imagine reading a travel guide to go on a vacation in France. You could read it and you think you know everything about France. But when you get to France as a tourist, suddenly you're like smelling the urine in the middle of Paris. And you're like, I didn't know Paris smelled like pee, right? You get there and you actually eat the croissant and it's way better than anything they could have described inside the travel guide. So reading gives you a lot of information about France. But if you've never been to France, you actually don't really know much about it. If you go as a tourist, that's an experience. It's still under your control, but not completely. And you have sort of the safety. You can always go back to your original views, but you've incorporated more information. The third way then to actually grow as a thinker is what I call encounter. And that's what happened to you with your wife. Encounter is where the power differential flips. And you are now face to face with things you can't explain with all the information and all the experiences you've had. For a lot of people, that happens by living abroad or marrying someone from another culture. I've lived in France, Central Africa, and Morocco. Those experiences changed me more than anything that I can possibly talk about. And the difference from being a tourist to someone living abroad is sizable. Suddenly, you need to learn the language. You have to understand how to dress. You have to learn the customs that you shouldn't violate. You have to reinterpret what's normal through somebody else's normal lens. So encounter, when we're talking about expanding as thinkers in our day-to-day lives, means deliberately seeking out relationships and experiences where you are uncomfortable, where the power differential is not in your favor. And so now I know when I have a knee-jerk like that wants to disqualify someone, I lean toward it and say, oh, I'm being self-protecting. I want to understand this drug user or that person who's protesting or this person who's standing up at a city hall meeting that I think is crazy. Like, I want to know. And of course, I had a very strong sort of religious affiliation in my young adulthood. And as I got older and the internet broke open, I was exposed to kind of a variety of people and views that I hadn't really paid attention to in my youth. And that started me on this sort of chain reaction. Living in Morocco absolutely flipped me. I mean, that was just an instant like, oh my gosh, life is not what I thought it was.
Yeah. Wow. So getting into schools and why this isn't happening in schools. It's so I grew this Instagram platform and I wanted to reach out to educators. I've had 3 different national teachers of the year on the podcast and stuff like that. But also because I have this viewpoint diversity podcast, my intention was to talk about all of the third rail issues, all of them. Because if I can approach it from a point of sincere curiosity and just being, Socrates in this thing, just asking questions, asking questions, then my thinking was, then I'm not going to get vilified because I'm just asking questions. And that was not the case.
Not true.
No. And the big organization that runs the National Teachers of the Year, said they would never bring someone on my podcast again. I had individuals, and I don't want to call them out by name or anything like that, but I just asked them very simple questions about some of those third rail issues, issues about race and gender and things like that. And they just balked at just asking questions. And what do we do about that, Julie? Because part of what it is these issues that are in the culture wars. Okay.
Yes.
So let's just say like those third rail issues. Okay. Teachers will either give their politicized side of it. They'll say like this side, typically it would be from the political left, but there's definitely places in Texas, Florida, et cetera, that
Ohio.
For sure. Ohio, probably.
Yeah.
I know a teacher in Iowa. Yeah, for sure. So they either pick the politicized one, or they just, I think more common is they're just smart and they're playing it smart and they just don't touch it at all. They're just like, I'm not going there. But then when those things come up, then the students are going to be curious about those things. They're going to be curious and how to approach it. So what do we do specifically in that area? This is a tough one for you, but like, what do we do in that area for all those educators out there that don't want to address those topics that we just can't address? I've been blocked and vilified by a lot of prominent educators for doing what I do. I mean, to be honest, I was so thrilled that you would come on this podcast because I was worried that you were like, oh, he might, bring up these issues. Because I didn't know you. He might bring up these issues, and those are just things I just don't want to talk about. We're not even going to talk about them specifically. But do you understand where I'm getting with this?
Of course I do.
It's a huge concern for me in the education system.
No, let me tell you that it's germane to everything in education. So there are two educational theorists that I really value around these conversations: bell hooks and Paulo Freire. I don't know if you've read either of them, but they're brilliant. Bell hooks is Black. Paulo Freire is from Latin America. Yeah. And both of them, I think, bring a lot of insight into what is failing in education. Education in the United States is so much about achievement, about being right, about assuming your place inside this sort of system that we all inhabit that has mostly been shaped by white identity. I mean, that's just a fact. And what we don't do is make meaningful space for people to actually investigate multiple views without having to take a position. So what we typically have is like a high school teacher will sometimes say, oh, let's do a mock debate. And so they'll say, let's talk about gun control, right? And so they'll divide the class into two groups: the pro-gun rights and the anti-gun rights, or the pro-gun control and the anti-gun control. And then they say, go find a bunch of information and then we're going to debate it. Yeah. To me, this is completely antithetical to critical thinking. What you're doing is you're treating kids like they should become propagandists for a position. Yep. They're not actually investigating it to understand it differently. So what I recommend, and I recommend this actually in my book and in my workbook, Becoming a Critical Thinker for Students, that you actually learn how to examine texts firsthand and interviews, etc. I have a whole strategy for doing that. But then identify what are the issues that are at stake in the topic. So if we're doing gun control, we have military that have reasons to use guns. We have police that use guns. We have victims of police violence, victims of military violence. We have victims of random shootings. We have gang violence. We have people who use gun for sport. We have hunters. Yeah. So we've got a list like everybody who's adjacent to the issue and all the things that are at stake for them when we're talking about these varieties of ways that we engage this topic. And we send all the students to look into as many of these as possible. We identify the students in the classroom who have personal experiences that shape their beliefs around this issue, and we listen to all of it. And the goal at the end is to come up with some kind of understanding that takes as many of those viewpoints into account as possible, that tries not to leave any of them out. It's an incredibly difficult challenge. This is literally what Congress is supposed to be, but it is not. But it could be what our children could learn. I wrote Raising Critical Thinkers and Becoming a Critical Thinker because I think critical thinking starts in the living room, and parents are not good at it. So my dual challenge for Raising Critical Thinkers was first to kind of convert them over, help them understand what it means to be one, and then give them the tools to do it. The orientation then for critical thinking is not even, from my view, to get it right, it's to include more. The more experiences, encounters, and facts we include, the better our beliefs, our understandings, our legislation, our laws, our communities, our families. So if we want to like scale this down, like just to a home, like to a family, you've got kids, let's say, who want to play video games all day long. You've got parents who are like, I don't want you on screens. The typical way to handle that is the parent decides the kid has to get with the program. The parent might pat them on the head and acknowledge their feelings, but they're like, I'm in charge, and the kid knows it. And you build all this resentment, or you create this sort of authority structure. But what would happen if we actually took our kids' feelings and needs seriously? We wrote it all down. We tried to tap into our own memories of being a child. We start to think about all the information we have on one side, but have we actually looked at information on the other? Have we investigated with our kids what it feels like to play? I always have moms say to me, if I let my kid play, they would never get off. I'm like, well, have you tested it? Is that actually true? Or do you just make that up as propaganda to persuade your kids? Because the truth is they don't. They get off eventually. They have to pee, they have to eat, they want to go outside. So what are we doing? Are we experimenting? Are we testing our theories? Are we including our children in their perspective? Is it possible that they might be playing and you see them fidgeting and you say, hey, honey, looks like you have to pee. I'll hold this space for you. Go pee. Have we helped them learn how to manage themselves with screens? No. Critical thinking is that. It's not getting the right perspective about screens.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I was a debate coach for like 10 years, but I don't like debate. People say like,
No.
oh, will you debate this? But it's like, I don't want to have a debate. I want to have a conversation.
No. Yes,
I want to
agreed.
I want to have a dialogue. I'm not interested in debate because debate, the purpose is to win. So even
Right.
if they make a really good point, I can't acknowledge that good point. That's not going to get me closer to the truth. You know, part of the way that when in the 2020, 2021, when there was a lot of discussion about the critical race theory.
Yes.
And I was vocal about some of the dangers of critical race theory. So
Okay.
Fox News sent a van to my house. They wanted to be on like Fox News. Now I don't watch Fox News, but they wanted me to come on and talk about it. And the people, I was on a panel. It's a weird situation when you're on that show. You're like in the back of a van. There's like anyway. It was like weird, but the people on the panel were saying like, this is complete nonsense. This is terrible. This is shouldn't be anywhere. And I was like, hold on. It's not complete nonsense. It's useful in a law setting. And I gave an example with the war on drugs, how the way it was started with John Ehrlichman and then the way it looks like with mass incarceration and stuff like that. And I was like, and it's a lens that you put on your eyes to look for, is there potential surreptitious racism here where we don't normally see it? And then you go, wait, it might be there. Then you take the critical race theory lenses off, and then you look at it through other eyes, and you try to break it down with data and things like that and different perspectives. But it's a good starting point to build a hypothesis. And they never invited me back because I was just supposed to say the thing that it's negative. But just the fact that so the conservatives got mad at me for not just saying that it's all bad, but then the people on the left, they wouldn't even touch me either because I was saying like, hold on, there's real dangers to some of the stuff that's being pushed here. There's a lot of, things like Coleman Hughes asked Ibram X. Kendi, how to be an anti-racist to a dialogue. He said, let's have a conversation. We'll sell tickets and we'll donate it to the United Negro College Fund and stuff. And Ibram Kendi didn't want to do it. And I was vocal about that. I said, I want to see a conversation between these sides. And one side seemed more willing to have the conversation than the other. So I was like, tended to side with the one that was more willing to talk. But essentially, just getting to that idea of nuance, I'm with you 100%. I think that, like I said earlier, if there's something that we're very divided on, there's gotta be legitimacy to that. Why are you not curious about what that is? But then it gets back to the same thing of like, well, my team says that this is bad, so it has to be bad.
Well, because the whole model in the States is conversion.
Yeah.
It is. And honestly, I remember reading not that long ago, actually, there was an article that talked about the Pilgrims, and they said they weren't fleeing to the United States for religious freedom. They were fleeing to the United States to found their religion for everyone, which is true. They were extremists. They were leaving because they could not enforce their extremism where they lived. They came here to be extreme. And I think Americans by birthright are extreme people. I've lived, like I said, in many other cultures, and Americans are a unique breed. We are very headstrong. And so, unfortunately, a lot of people say AI and the internet are going to ruin us, but I claim that it is visual media that has changed everything. And it started at the beginning of the 20th century. It is the power of us being able to see each other, to have that nightly influence, to be always in touch with everything that's going on visually, and it impacts our nervous system. And so one of the ways we feel safe, as we know biologically, is to be in a tribe, to be in our group, to belong. And the only model that we've been shown, and if you look at it historically in terms of religion in the United States, conversion has cost people lives. It's, this has been a model that we all love, this sort of missionary model. And now we see it in politics. They were showing a graph of the Congress from the 1960s, and you had Democrats and Republicans voting on all different issues,
Right.
sometimes
Right.
liberal. And now it's literally just a y-axis. They all line up wherever their party is. So to me, I'm in my 60s. I'll die before this gets solved. But I really hope that in the home, we could actually foment a revolution. It's why I really believe in homeschooling. The word revolution is way too strong. It's not really what I mean. I just feel like what we're looking for is a much more honest appraisal of how much we have to share, how much we have to share, how much we need to understand each other. 2020 was such a crazy season, the way the Black Lives Matter intersected with this Asian hate, which intersected with the pandemic, which intersected with economic crisis. And it was such an opportunity. And there were moments where I saw glimpses of opportunity, but it is really hard for people to shed their self-protection, and critical thinking actually requires it. So, my hope, one of the people that has been a light to me, I don't know if you've ever studied Hans-Georg Gadamer. Do you know who he is?
I don't.
Okay. He's, one of those German philosopher, theologian types, but he wrote a book called Truth and Method, which is how to do hermeneutics of a text. And what's missing, in my view, is the critical thinking of how you examine text. And a text could be written, but today it could be visual media or TikTok. It could be spoken. And when we're examining a text, there are 3 levels that we're always having to consider. First level is the actual text itself. Who wrote it, for whom, in what context, what did they include, what did they leave out? Like if we think of the Gettysburg Address, it's about slavery, and Lincoln never uses the word slaves. Why? That's an interesting question, right? So we look at the level of the text and the person who wrote it. And we call that the horizon of the author. The second horizon is the interpreter. And we have to ask all those questions of ourselves. Like, how do I understand this text? What am I bringing to it? Do I understand the definition of this word? And that word means something to me today. I don't know if it meant that to that person. I have an example of that in just a minute. So those are the 2 intersecting horizons. The third is the interpretation, which is called a fusion of horizons. And that fusion lives as long as manna. It's a 24-hour interpretation, because by tomorrow, a new factor will influence it. So all interpretations include the author and the current times, and they reflect current issues and needs. If we don't know how to do that, we get stuck almost like in a time warp, and we stop evolving. I was just reading about I was in DC this last week, and I was reading about, the founding documents. And it's so fascinating to see how Thomas Jefferson was like, hey, times are going to change. Like, you might need to revisit this language. And I was like, yeah, but I was in homeschooling with all these originalists who are like, no, the words can never change. And it's just funny to see all of that, right? Just to see all of it and what we bring when we're reading back into texts. So did you read my book already? Do you know the first story that I tell in Raising Critical Thinkers? I wondered if I could share that because
Oh, can you share it?
yeah, it's very illustrative of what we're talking about. So I think you'll like it. So I have grandparents who are no longer with me, but in the 1990s, they were both living in Riverside. I was in LA at the time, and my grandfather died, and my grandmother had dementia. So we started sorting through all of my grandfather's personal effects. He was a Chicago Catholic Irish guy. He always said, you know, he had the big three. He was Irish, Catholic, and Democrat. Like that was his life.
Okay.
And his daughter, my aunt, was a former nun. His other daughter, my mother, was living in Northern California, so she wasn't there. And then my youngest aunt is like a progressive, like she's only 6 years older than me, 18 years younger than my mother, living in Italy, married, just a progressive Catholic. Okay. So we get out this box and we start looking through all these letters that were in unsealed envelopes. And I open it up and realize these are love letters my grandfather had been writing to my grandmother in 1997. He died in 97. So I pull one out and I start reading it aloud. And he says, "Remember, Eva, when we climbed the little hill to where we first made love." And I dropped this letter and I was like, ladies, my grandparents had sex before marriage. Like I just immediately reacted.
Yeah.
And my older aunt, who's the nun, was like, that could not have happened. They didn't have sex. That can't be what it meant. And my younger aunt, the progressive, is like, they lectured me about virginity and they were off having sex on a hill before they were married. Okay. So this became a big debate in my family. And here's the crazy thing. In the 1920s, to make love just meant to put the moves on. It just meant like flirting. Like if you've seen It's a Wonderful Life, there's a point where Mary says, he's making violent love to me, mother, but they're on the phone. Like it just means he's like flirting.
Yeah.
So was he using that language as a memory to stoke the memory of his wife who was struggling with dementia? But it was 1997. He knew that word pair had evolved. It had become to make love. So, or was this like a secret confession that none of us were supposed to ever know about?
Right.
And it became a huge family debate. And here's the thing, we'll never know. He died and she had dementia. And you could make a case for either interpretation.
You can.
And in fact, I was going to say, and in fact, if I were to write a paper about it, I would include both possibilities because that's what critical thinking does.
I love that. That's a great way to kind of like put a point on it. You know, I think also in some way it doesn't matter. It's about sharing. It's about making love, and whether that is like the physical acts of like what you do. It's like it's the fact that they had a real connection that was a joint moment of like love, like a unity that they shared with each other. And there's a lot of people that could have sex and they're not making love, and there's a lot of people that can hold hands and that's making love. So I mean, just the fact it's a beautiful moment any way you slice it too. Which
It
is
is.
cool.
I loved starting my book with that because a lot of people told me a critical thinking book would be boring. And so I was like, well, then I'm going to start with sex. And then I remembered this story. But it's such a good illustration of how we think we know what things mean. And honestly, critical thinking means taking it the step further. And both of my aunts, they were forcing the interpretation to match their agenda, right? Their background, their beliefs. And that's what we do. The ability to hold back and say, actually, I don't know. I hope it means this. I'm afraid it might mean this. I don't know what it means about this for me. That's where critical thinking is really powerful. And the more we do that in our relationships, the better our relationships are too. It's a good hack for a marriage, actually.
Absolutely. It's helped me heal my relationships with like my parents and friends and family.
Oh, that's
and stuff
beautiful.
Like that. I mean, seeing people the way they wish to be seen. I mean, there's so many different techniques that I have that I try to apply. So you essentially have leaned into this critical thinking thing, because you're kind of like the Gandhi quote, like being the change you wish to see in the world. You see this as a need and you wish to be the change. Cause that's why I am. I mean, walking away from the classroom is very scary, very difficult for me. It's very difficult, but I getting my students, and I get these amazing letters from their parents and from them like, 10 years later, 15 years later about how
cool.
I shaped the way that they see the world. And it's like, I should do this for more than 70 kids a year or 100 kids.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I feel very called to do it. And I feel equipped because I have this brain that is naturally just very, very curious. I'm not, I've talked to some very, very smart people in this podcast. I mean, you included, but like, I've these like these like college professors with crazy high IQs. And it's just like, I'm just curious. Like, I'm just curious. Like, that's my superpower for being a teacher is I just am very, very curious. And then as I ask questions and I keep asking questions, then I can get it down to a streamline. I can take a complicated issue, get it to be kind of simple. And then I just give that pathway to my students. And that's what seems to work. So is that part why you went from just writing in general to critical thinking? Was it to be the change that you wish to see in the world to some degree?
Yes, I'm sure that's true. I probably wouldn't have used that language, but I think everybody always says when you're a writer that you write what you need. And I was on this critical thinking journey for 30 years. I first got onto the internet in 1996. There were two places that homeschoolers went to have conversations. They were both dominated by white, Protestant, evangelical, heterosexual, married women. Okay, so we were like a homogeneous group who all shared similar beliefs. And yet we got into bloodbaths online over things like breastfeeding, whether or not to use a diaper service or Pampers. Oh, yeah. Over VBACs. And then theologically, oh my gosh, the arguments even got more intense, And I remember just asking this question. It wasn't who's right. My question was, why does everyone think they're right? I was shocked at how assertive these women, who, if I had seen them at a park day, would have been so nice to me, we're calling each other's names. I used to joke that, we invented trolling because I made a lot of really close friends, but remember when the internet was new, we didn't even know to be careful. So people would just make a declaration like, well, that's a dumb idea because they just thought everyone would fall in line. And that sent me on this unbelievable and intense journey. I ended up going to grad school to actually work through all the issues. Like it was serious for me. And I think it was really underscored by this idea that being right was not possible and that everyone was under this delusion that the goal was to be right instead of to actually have a connection, understand kind of what you said, staying open, staying curious. It doesn't mean you can't have beliefs. E.M. Forster, who's my favorite fiction author, he says in A Room with a View that eventually you are going to have to stand somewhere. You can't just keep hopping around from one postmodern lily pad to the next. And believe me, I'd love to. I love postmodernism. It saved my life in so many ways. But eventually you are going to vote. You are going to stand somewhere. So his idea is you stand facing the sun for all you're worth, casting as little shadow as possible. And that's what I do. I'm constantly looking for my shadow so that I don't suddenly wipe out an important view or an important person who needs to be integrated into this world.
Yeah. One last question for you along those lines is, where do you struggle the most with this? Because I've had 9 different transgender people in the podcast. I've had transgender people that wear red MAGA hats and were there on January 6th. I've had blue-haired activists. I've had 2 pro-life, 2 pro-choice people. I've covered it all. Good
for you.
Yeah, it's been such an eye-opener. So like I have my stances, but like I understand why people take the stances that they do. And I can argue for both sides so well. What would be an area that you would be open to admitting that like, oh, this is an area that I kind of struggle with? Or is there like an umbrella kind of area that you kind of struggle with when that comes up, you're just like, oh, it's just so hard for me to even go down the road of trying to understand that?
I don't think I have a thing that I wouldn't be willing to understand, but I will say this, the conversation around transgender continues to fascinate me, and I try to stay current with as much of the diverse discussion as is possible. Yeah. So I'm interested in therapists as well as families. I have a few Brave Writer families who have kids who are trans who had a huge impact on me. But then I also have friends who are therapists who are seeing it through a different lens, for teenagers. And so I refuse to take a position. I am very much affirming of the struggle for each person in the equation. I can fully empathize with what a parent might feel, what a student might feel. So if you want to know an issue, that would be the one. Okay, that's the one where I haven't like drawn any boundaries on it, but I'm also not confident.
Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with a young woman named Chloe Cole, but
Mm-mm.
I had her on the podcast. She, when she was 13, she started taking hormones and puberty blockers and stuff like that. She got a double mastectomy at 15, and at 16 realized she wasn't trans, that she's actually
Oof.
autistic.
Oof.
And it just decimated her life in so many ways. And she told her story. I was holding back tears the entire conversation. And she's been vilified because she's being labeled as like a transphobe now. And it's just like, oh my gosh, guys, hold on. Like this is getting really gnarly. But like her story is one of those ones that, like, for example, you never heard of, you know, and it's not because you're not willing to hear it. It's just like there's certain stories that add nuance to it that makes it really complicated. So certain people's perspectives get shut down. But I also had Mac Beggs, who went through a similar thing, Texas state champion wrestler in the women's division, but is a trans man who started taking hormones and puberty blockers and stuff like that at like 14 or 15, and is doing great. You know,
That's just it.
it's a
It's
really tricky one. When I have Mac and Chloe in my, you know, I have their numbers in my phone and I text them and stuff like that, then it's like, oh man, this is really, really complex. This is a really hard one. And people don't like that kind of thing, like we've been
They
kind of
don't.
talking
And
about
it's very
conversation.
hard to legislate when you're dealing with
Yeah.
personal experience.
Yes.
One of the families in my community told me that her son, at age 4, she was putting him to bed. They were a church going family. And as she said prayers with him, he turned to her and he said, "Why did God make me a boy when he knows I'm a girl?"
Mhm.
And that is such a strange thing to hear from a
Yeah.
4-year-old, right?
Yeah.
Like this is someone who didn't know. It wasn't like they were a teenager. So when I heard that story, I remember thinking, wow, that's information I wouldn't have known how to handle either.
Yeah.
And I think that's the piece I wish we were a little more patient around. I honestly, I was, Operation Rescue pro-lifer in the 90s, if you can believe that. And then in the year 2000, I had posted something about being pro-life on my blog, and somebody wrote under it that the pro-choice position was the high moral ground. And I had been so in the pro-life position, I thought pro-choice knew they weren't moral. They just wanted what they wanted. And I thought, well, wait a minute. Maybe I'm not reading their own self-description. And I went on a 2-year journey of reading only pro-choice literature to understand it better, and came to a completely new conclusion.
Mm.
And it's a much more nuanced position than what I had. And I'm pretty troubled by the way it's erupting right now. Honestly, I feel like
Yeah.
we've completely lost the thread. But that was a massive journey for me, just re-examining abortion after being so committed. My husband went to prison for blockading, right? Like we were for that. So I've held some extreme positions, and I've certainly had to really re-examine probably everything.
Yeah.
I figure if I ever write a memoir, it'll be how the internet saved my life, because literally everything that is in my life has changed because of the internet.
Well, you know what? I mean, it's all information. People are like, don't get information from the internet. It's like every library is on the internet. What are you talking about? Like
Exactly.
it's everything. And even social network, like I mentioned
Yeah.
John Haidt and anxious generation and stuff. Like there's a lot of dangers to social networks, but if you use it to be a social network, that if you go, man, how could someone possibly be a blah 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 blah? Okay, you can find them, reach out to
Yep.
them, connect with them. That's essentially how this podcast started. Is I was like, I've never
Amazing.
actually sat down and had a conversation with someone from these identity markers. So I'm going to invite them, and then I'm going to invite
It's
someone who is a
awesome.
totally different one. And that's exactly what I want to bring to Paradox. What I built now is this kind of thinking to try and promote that as much as possible out into the world. So so just
That's
wrapping this up, because
fabulous.
we've done thank you so much. You know, your support means a lot, you know, and I see now, you know, having this conversation with you, you know, I've read your things and seen your work and stuff like that. But like to have this conversation with you, it's really encouraging, because like, yeah, like this is the pathway forward. Oh, by the way, like when I was following you on social media, I was looking at who follows you, and it's a wide mix of people
It
from the
sure
left and
is.
right. I was like, that's right, because my scroll is wild. It's like all over the place. It's like AOC and like Ben Shapiro. It's like all over the place. So I don't know. And then that just leads me to asking questions, and then that's how I lead my class and my students and stuff.
It's awesome.
I think it's the way to go, at least for me, and at least as an educator, I think that's the way to go. I think it's what's really
Yes.
missing in education. You filled that gap really, really well. Where can people get access to your work, follow you on social media,
Yeah.
buy your books, all of that kind of stuff? Please just give it to us. Give it to us.
Thanks. Well, raisingcriticalthinkers.com has Raising Critical Thinkers and my brand new workbook for teenagers called Becoming a Critical Thinker. And it's great. I mean, I really want teens to use it. And I think parents are going to get a lot out of it by doing it with their teens. So that one is brand new. And then bravewriter.com is my company, and we teach writing. We have online writing classes, and people always ask me, is there critical thinking in it? Well, yes, that's exactly the format of everything we do. So we have writing programs and online classes as well. And then if you want to follow me and interact with me directly, Julie Brave Writer is my Instagram account and my Threads account, and I'm active in both of those spaces.
Julie Bogart, thank you so much for coming here. Thank you for talking to me about critical thinking. Thank you for doing all the work that you do to support families. It really makes a difference. And it's inspiring to me now, diving into this world head first, that there's a want for it, there's a need for it, there's a thirst for it. So thank you so much for all of the work that you've done over the years, Julie.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. It matters.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. Take care, guys. Thank you for listening.